This is a progress bar analytics presentation about the value in failing a marathon. This journey started in 2013 after my second episode with cancer, when I lost everything good in my life. So I started this new chapter in my life with a heart full of vengeance and the intention to take everything back with interest. This journey started innocently enough with a bucket list marathon. The first part of the marathon up until 13.1 miles was familiar, and at this point in my life I could do 13.1 miles relatively comfortably even though I hated running. The next 3.5 hours were a giant mess of running, walking, whining, and crying, and swearing off the marathon that I would never, ever do this again to myself. After the marathon, I spent a solid month sore. And if you'll notice from the data over here, 2014 was a pretty lonely year for races. Even though I had started this new purpose, in 2014 I'd still only done one race, which was the marathon. So let me tell you about the diminishing returns a person of reasonable ambition could possibly expect after doing one bucket list marathon. For the first month, you're filled with elation and you're surrounded by congratulations. And in the pursuing weeks and months, the feeling of accomplishment quickly diminishes. And while that feeling of accomplishment diminished, I had some time to regret the quality of how I finished the marathon. And for a few months, I regretted whining and crying and swearing off the marathon for the last 3.5 hours. I mean, certainly it's an accomplishment to finish a marathon despite hating running, avoiding it as much as possible, yet getting on with doing the accomplishment anyways. But eventually, these type of excuses will start to sound lame to anybody of reasonable ambition. So I found myself on New Year's Eve itching for redemption. January 1st, I signed up for the Surf City Marathon in beautiful Huntington Beach, California. This was going to be my first non-Disney half marathon, and for a non-runner, you're really looking for as flat a race as possible. When I arrived at the start line, I was really taken in by how beautiful the course would be. You get to run along PCH, and you get to have a beach view for most of the race. My goals for this race were pretty simple. Finish in less than 6 hours, and don't whine and cry at the end about never ever again. My plan was to follow the 5-hour stick, so that in the best case scenario I could have a personal record, and at the worst case I could meet my goals. Following the 5-hour stick would mean that I was running at about 11.5 minutes per mile, which was very doable for me, being somebody that had done half marathons in about 10.5 to 11 minutes per mile. Everything was going well until tragedy struck at mile 15, when both of my legs spasmed and my calves and quads were twitching out of control. The pain was excruciating, but I waved away the concerned bikers with the first aid suits. In retrospect, perhaps pursuing another marathon while not actually liking running was ill-advised, but I was really on a mission here. 15 miles was already behind me, which was more than I had ever continuously run before, which left me with 11 miles of ouch. If you've ever tried moving around after you've had your calves and quads spasm, it really hurts a lot. To give you some scale about the rest of this race, I finished the first 15 miles in 172 minutes, leaving 235 minutes, about 4 hours for 11 miles. I had 4 hours to keep asking myself, do I keep hobbling or do I give up? For better or for worse, I chose to press on. At 22 minutes per mile, it was pretty slow going. After a half mile of hobbling and full pain, there was a sign that said full marathon, turn around here, while the finish line was within line of sight. So I made that very sad U-turn away from the Huntington Beach Pier and going towards Bolsa Chica. After a few miles of hobbling, there were a giant line of Winnebagos cooking bacon and jeering the marathon runners. Another painful thing was that during this 4 hours of hobbling, I was passed by runners of all shapes and sizes and ages. It's not many times in your life that you get really tested to find out what you're really made of, but that day I found out. Oh, and to give you some extra perspective about my walking speed, or hobbling speed, I should say, the 1 mile walking speed for a 20-year-old in fair health is between 15 and 16 minutes, while for a 70-plus-year-old, it's in between 22 to 24 minutes. And why would a survivor go on to hobble for 4 hours? Well, I drew a lot of comparisons to chemotherapy during those 4 hours. Some of the similarities including that it felt awful the whole time. I was kept on questioning myself, when will it ever end? But the one main difference was that while in my marathon giving up was an option, during chemotherapy it was not. For myself, and for a lot of people, the question remains, why go through all that to finish a marathon? And there was kind of a multiple choice for me. A, I wanted to see how far I could persevere when giving up was an option. B, I was wearing my rings, which represented my commitment to never ever giving up, a promise I made to my boys in my darkest hours. C, if you recall from earlier in the previous year, I had already experienced a did not finish race, and I would gladly suffer so I wouldn't have to earn another one. And you may have guessed it, it was actually all of the above. There I was in 2015 trying to redeem myself, ended up finishing last. It was the nightmare of all first-time runners, that I'm going to be the one that they're picking up the cones behind, and everybody is going to be in front of me. What value am I supposed to derive out of this? Well, to be honest with you, it took me 407 minutes to finish the marathon, and on that day, I learned how to persist for 7 hours. Not only that, after you have a big failure in your books, you realize it's not so scary anymore. You're not afraid to fail.